walk in the footsteps of heroes on a Ledger Battlefields tour.
Welcome to the History Channel podcast in association with Ledger Battlefield Tours. Men from every corner of the British Commonwealth fought in the trenches of the Western Front. We follow their story from Vimy Ridge to the Somme. This is Vimy Ridge Canadian Memorial. It commemorates not just the triumph and capture of the high ground around the city of Arras in northern France, but more than 11,000 Canadian soldiers who fell from 1915 until the end of the war who have no known grave. In the years following the First World War, the Canadians erected memorials on all the sites where their soldiers had fought. Canada as a nation had lost more than 60,000 dead in the trenches of World War I, and they wanted one main focus for their remembrance. The obvious place to do that was Vimy Ridge. Former military commanders, and indeed many veterans, felt that it was almost as if Canada as a nation had come together on the slopes of Vimy Ridge. It was the first and only time during the war in which men from every part of Canada had fought side by side in one major attack. 45 minutes south of Vimy Ridge, we travel into the haunting Somme battlefields of 1916. Very different ground to flat Flanders, rolling chalk downland, very similar to the Sussex Downs. Here at Mucky Farm, or Mukau Farm to the troops, this was the troublesome left flank of the Australian forces on the Somme. Wave after wave of Australian attack was wiped out here in the summer of 1916 as both sides struggled for possessions of the ruined farm buildings. Over on the right flank, at the Pozières windmill site, the highest point on the Somme battlefields, there was many weeks of fighting before Australian troops captured that ground in August of 1916. The Australian losses in the First World War are more commonly associated with the Gallipoli campaign of 1915, where over 8,000 Australian soldiers died. But in 2 years on the Western Front, more than 40,000 of them perished in the trenches of northern France and Flanders, symbolising the great sacrifice and the important involvement of Australian troops in that theatre of war. One of the smaller Commonwealth nations to contribute to the fighting on the Western Front was South Africa. A few miles south of Pozières is Deauville Wood, or Devil's Wood to the troops because of its murderous reputation. On the 14th of July 1916, 3,500 members of the South African Brigade entered Deauville Wood and fought amongst the trees for the next 6 days. There were no trenches in the wood at that stage. It was a matter of fighting from tree to tree, smashed tree to smashed tree, shell hole to shell hole. At one stage, several hundred shells a minute were dropping on Deauville Wood. At the end of those 6 days, the South Africans had held the wood, but had been forced back to a tiny pocket in the southwest corner. And as they marched out and were relieved by British troops coming in, who continued the battle for the next 2 months, out of those 3,500 men that had entered the wood, only 750 officers and men remained. In the years following World War I, they purchased the wood from the landowner and erected a memorial to South African troops who'd fallen in the Great War, cleared one section of the wood and planted it with saplings, specially brought over from South Africa. But one tree had survived, the last remaining tree of Deauville Wood, which is still growing even today. Many visitors to Deauville Wood think that the military cemetery contains the graves of the South Africans who fought and died here in 1916. But with the nature of the shelling, the majority of them were missing. A few miles down the road, we find our missing South Africans from Deauville Wood at the Deauville Memorial to the Missing. This massive construction commemorates nearly 73,000 British and South African soldiers who fell on the Somme battlefields who have no known grave. Every regiment of the British Army is listed on this memorial. It almost reads like an A to Z of British surnames. The 4 years of the First World War saw an intense stretch of manpower in the trenches of the Western Front. Men from every corner of the British Empire were required to fight here in France and Flanders. And the demand for new troops meant that few parts of the Commonwealth of the Empire escaped the Western Front. And we find visible evidence of that today with the cemeteries and memorials that commemorate Commonwealth troops.
Walk in the footsteps of heroes on a Ledger Battlefields tour.